Good morning, everybody. First, I would like to thank all the members of the jury and the audience for attending this PhD presentation. My name is Arnaud Tanguy, and I will be presenting the work done on visual SLAM for humanoid robot localization and closed-loop control. So this thesis has been shaped by two main projects. First, there has been the DARPA Robotics Challenge. It is inspired by the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster. And the challenge consisted in 8 disaster response tasks that were aimed to emulate the conditions at the nuclear plant, such as driving a car, egressing this car, turning a valve, walking around a rubber field, and so on. But the most important project in my thesis has been the humanoid project. It is an industrial manufacturing project led in collaboration with Airbus, and the aim is to introduce humanoid robots in the aircraft manufacturing process. The important thing to note here is that in this context, we usually have a good knowledge of the environment, and we have CAD models of every part. And the important thing is to be able to localize the robot within that environment and be able to design control strategies that allow the robot to move within that environment and interact with it. So in this thesis, we made the choice to focus on using dense visual simultaneous localization and mapping. Sorry for the note. We chose this because the methods provide simultaneously a 3D map of the environment and the 6D pose of the camera in this environment. So the translation and rotation of your vision sensor. Furthermore, the method is widely available and relies on cheap sensors such as camera and RGBD cameras that are already available on most humanoid robots. Also, there is a lot of ready-to-use visual SLAM methods that are very high quality, such as the one developed at I3S by Maxime Meillan and Andrew Comport, or open source ones such as Continuous and Elastic Fusion. So this availability means that we can straight away try to use these methods for control. First, let me introduce the concept of dense visual SLAM, how it works. So the first step is called view registration, and it is the process by which we are able to estimate the motion of a sensor with respect to the images it acquires. So the idea is that you will observe the same scene from different viewpoints. First viewpoint is considered as a reference, so it is composed of an RGB image, the color image obtained by your RGBD sensor, and a depth image that represents how far the points are in the environment. And to estimate the motion of the sensor, the idea is to try and define an error that compares all the pixels in the image and all the depth points in the depth map, and tries to find the transformation T that wraps one image onto the other viewpoint. So if you're able to wrap all the points, the error will be minimized and you have found the proper transformation. So mathematically this writes as a photometric error that compares intensities in the image. So you're comparing the intensity of the reference image of each point with the intensity of the wrapped pixel by the transformation you're trying to find. And the geometric error does the same, but for geometry. Here it's a point-to-plane error, where you're trying to minimize the error between a 3D point and the tangent plane of the other image points. These errors are combined and weighted by a parameter alpha that tries to match the scale of the influence of intensities and the influence of depth points. And this error is typically minimized using iteratively weighted least squares, and which ultimately leads to the estimation of the motion of the camera with respect to the reference frame. So this method is highly local. You can only track the motion of the camera as long as you can reproject one image onto another. So if there is not enough overlap, it is no longer possible. So to extend this view registration process to full environment, we usually introduce, a common method is to introduce the notion of keyframe graph. So the idea is that you will first track locally using view registration with respect to one keyframe, and when your viewpoint has differed too much, you will introduce a new reference frame and keep the transformation between the transformation that you have just estimated as the link between these frames. So as you move around the environment, you add new nodes in that graph. And this allows you to always have the position of the camera with respect to the initial position where you started from. The keyframe graph has other advantages. One main advantage is that when tracking, you can, instead of just considering a single image as your reference, you can use the nearby keyframes and reproject them into the same virtual keyframe that integrates all the information from the different viewpoints. So this allows to avoid artifacts like missing depths here and improve the quality of the texture and so on, and provide better tracking with respect to this reference. Another advantage is that when the sensor observes an already explored part of the environment, it is possible to create loop closures in the graph, that is to jointly optimize the pose of the sensor and the keyframes in that loop to correct some drifts that will occur during the view registration process. So here is just a simple result of the previous slide. It's a robot within its environment, localized with visual SLAM, and tracked over time through the keyframe graph. I will now introduce the first contribution that I did during this thesis. It's related to kinematic chain calibration. So why do we want to do kinematic chain calibration? Because having an imprecise kinematic model will lead to problems in control. If we are not able to estimate the position of any surface on the robot accurately, we cannot manipulate objects precisely in the environment. And the kinematic chain can be imprecise, maybe because the kinematic model provided by the constructor is not accurate enough, or maybe because there was some damage during operation. Here we broke the attachment of the camera during an experiment where we were trying to climb some stairs, and it fell on the supporting rope. And in the state of the art, what we found is that most methods rely on calibration patterns, such as here, and they are not autonomous and not online. Usually these calibration methods require human intervention, and thus cannot be applied if your robot needs calibration on the field during operation. And also, it's usually distinct methods that are used for extrinsic sensor calibration. This is the calibration of the position of the sensor with respect to the robot, and kinematic chain calibration. So in this work, we aim to fuse both methods to simultaneously estimate the transformation between the vision sensor and the robot model, but also the transformation between each joint of the robot, so the kinematic model. For extrinsic calibration, a common method is the hand-eye calibration that was proposed by Tsai in the 80s. The concept is to relate sensor motions to robot motions through the rigid link between the robot and the sensor. Typically, the sensor motion is obtained using calibration patterns. And here, in this work, we got rid of this requirement by exploiting the capability of SLAM to track the sensor motion. Another point is that the robot body motion is usually computed by assuming that the kinematic model is fully known. And here in this work, we try to unify kinematic calibration with extrinsic calibration, so we cannot make this assumption. And we will need to estimate this parameter as well. Before explaining how we extend it to whole body calibration, let's consider the necessary conditions in the hand-eye case to estimate the transformation X, the calibration parameters. And a convenient way to look at the problem is to represent the motion of the sensor, A, and the robot, B, as screw motions. That is a motion that is represented by a line and a rotation and translation along that line. And this representation has interesting properties, such as the screw congruence theorem, which states that the rotation angle and the rotation along the screw and the translation are independent from the viewpoint where you look at the screw from. So in the case of hand-eye, this means that since both A and B represent the same motion, since they are rigidly linked, They can both be decomposed into screw motions with interesting properties. The first is that the screw axis does depend on the calibration parameters, but that the rotation and translation along that axis does not depend on the calibration. Here it's equal in both cases. This remark means that with only one robot motion, you can only constrain 4 out of the 6 degrees of freedom of the calibration pose that you're trying to optimize. And that to obtain the calibration, what you need is a second non-parallel motion. That is a motion that is not in the same screw axis as the initial one, so that you can render h and theta here observable. Now we extend the hand-eye calibration to a whole kinematic chain. So the concept is very similar. The goal is to create a closed kinematic loop between a fixed point in the environment and through all joints of the robot and their respective calibration that you are trying to find. The main problem in formulating the calibration problem like this is that instead of the hand-eye case where the robot motion is assumed to have 6 degrees of freedom, it's a full transformation that can lead to full observability as we've seen before if we have 2 different robot motions. Here, since we don't assume the kinematic model to be known, the robot motion is only determined by the joint intrinsic motion, which has in general less than 6 degrees of freedom, which will cause problems for observability of your calibration parameters. So in the case of humanoid robots, and in particular the HAP4 that we considered here, we usually have 2 use cases. We have the case of revolute joints, which have only 1 degree of freedom. It's only a rotation around one axis. And in that case, this means that the screw axis for both A and B will be coaxial, and which signifies that it's impossible to determine the rotation and translation along that joint axis. So basically you can get solutions such as the red ones here, where you're somewhere along the axis in some rotation along that axis, and the other parameters are still possible to be determined, such as the orthogonal directions to the axis. This is an interesting observation because that means that we can do a partial calibration. If we already know a guess of the calibration parameters along that axis, it is still possible to improve the calibration parameter along the other directions. The second use case is that of revolute joints with 2 degrees of freedom. We have them in the head, torso, hips of the robot. Most joints have 2 degrees of freedom like this in HRP4. And in that case, the screw axis will be skew, which brings us to the case of hand-eye calibration when it's fully observable, which means that in that case, we can obtain the complete solution just from the joint motion. So to apply this observability analysis to the whole kinematic chain problem, we can do this recursively by ensuring that the first joints are fully constrained and moving down the chain and ensuring that every time each joint remains fully constrained. So here we have 2 degrees of freedom motion on the chest, 2 degrees of freedom motion on the head, and 2 degrees of freedom in the hips. So in that case, we are able to obtain the full calibration parameters x1, x2, and x3 between the joints. So here is a simulation done on HRP4 kinematic chain. So we perform a simple motion of the chest and head, and we only observe the joint encoders and the sensor motion obtained tracked, well, here not with SLAM, but by forward kinematics of the model. And we obtain the camera calibration of both the extrinsic between the sensor and the head and the torso. And this method is online, which means as we get more and more information, we can refine this estimation and become more precise. So we have done the same experiment on the real robot with the visual SLAM developed at I3S. So here you can see that the robot, during the robot motion, the point cloud of the environment is being reconstructed. So this is a keyframe graph being constructed, and the camera localization is tracked, but we still don't know where it is with respect to the robot. And as new data is acquired, we can constrain the problem and obtain the calibration of both the camera and the head. This could be extended to more joints on the robot by considering, for instance, for the knees, the default calibration of the knee along the observable non-observable directions and improving the other ones. So to summarize this part of my work, we have developed an autonomous calibration method that, contrary to the state of the art, does not rely on calibration patterns and instead uses SLAM to track the camera motion. We do not make any a priori on the kinematic model. The robot motion is fully determined by just its joint motions. It's a unified framework for both extrinsic and kinematic chain calibration. It's fully autonomous, and we provide it as an open source implementation such that everybody who wishes to use it can do so. The next part of this talk, I will be considering humanoid robot control and how to introduce dense visual SLAM within existing control strategies. The objective is to be able to take into account the state of the robot with respect to its real environment. And we do this by integrating SLAM inside the control strategy. We considered three types of closed-loop control here. The first is at the level of multi-contact planning, where the aim is to be able to localize and establish contacts with the environment robustly. The second is at the level of model predictive control, where we try to use SLAM feedback as more frequent feedback by computing the position of the center of mass of the robot, by estimating the position of the center of mass of the robot. Finally, we looked at whole body control and how to close the control loop of a quadratic whole body controller with the information from the environment and SLAM. So here's the three categories I talked about before. So for multi-contact planning, usually we have in the state of the art some multi-contact planners that will provide contacts with respect to CAD models and postures at the robot, feasible postures for the robot. For model predictive control, in our case, we will look at the problem of walking. And this type of control consists of predicting the future, a couple of footsteps in the future, and computing the trajectory of the center of mass and the next footsteps that the robot will need to take. And finally, the whole body controller takes care of realizing this motion. First, let me introduce the two main components, the whole body control. This is achieved through quadratic programming. The idea is that you define a set of tasks and constraints that you apply on your robot. So constraints will be, for instance, the dynamics of your system, where your contacts are, they are fixed with respect to the ground, the joint limits of your robot, and some other properties such as collision avoidance and so on. And sorry about this. And tasks will represent objectives that you want to give to your robot, such as driving an end effector from one position to another, or keeping the center of mass at the desired position, and so on. This is formalized as a quadratic programming optimization that will compute the joint accelerations and forces at the contact, and is later integrated into positions that you can send to our position controlled robot. So the result of this local optimization will be the joint motion of the robot that allows you to realize the tasks that you want. And this is directly linked with multi-contact planning, where the sequence of contacts is used to generate a finite state machine that will provide tasks to the QP controller and constraints that will later compute the joint positions that to be realized on the robot. So far, the whole method has been, when I started this thesis, the whole method was completely open loop, like in this simulation where you don't take into account the state of the robot, you just assume that everything works perfectly. So here the multi-contact planner provides some desired contacts, and the QP controller provides the robot motion that allows you to reach these contacts while maintaining the constraints on your robot. So this is like a model from an A400M aircraft, and we are supposed to enter in this very constrained area here, so we need to establish a lot of contacts with the environment and robustly use them. And the problem with such an open loop control is that as soon as you establish a contact, you might have some slippage or not establish a contact exactly where you want. And if you continue without taking into account the state of the environment, you will inevitably drift and fail to realize such complex tasks. So it's very important to introduce perception within that context. And here in that section, we will see how to take into account the environment map and still realize multi-contact plans. So the idea is to extend the existing framework by introducing visual SLAM in the process. So as the robot moves, we can estimate a map of the environment in the form of the keyframe graph, or that can be converted to 3D point clouds if needed. And the plan performed on CAD models, the CAD models themselves can be localized within the environment through registration, which establishes the link between the contact surfaces that the robot has to reach on the CAD model and the real contact surfaces in the environment. Furthermore, the camera position can be used to inform the quadratic programming control, the tasks, to alter the robot behavior according to the observed state. So first, how do we achieve the registration between CAD models and the environment? We have used the iterative closest point method. This choice is driven by the availability of CAD models in an industrial context, such as the humanoid project and the DARPA Robotics Challenge. The idea is similar to that of the view registration problem of SLAM. The concept is to minimize a geometric error between two sets of points, one acquired by sampling the CAD model of whichever task you want to realize, and the second is obtained by reprojecting the keyframe graph of SLAM in a 2 or 3D point cloud. Unfortunately, this estimation process is highly local, which means that you need to provide an initial guess for the position of your CAD model in the world. And this can be done manually here by modifying the position of a 3D marker, or you can use some a priori information known about your robot. For instance, if you're sitting in a car, you know that the wheel will be in front of you approximately at some position, and you can directly do the registration in that case. The reason that no global registration method is used here is that the existing methods based on point clouds are very time-consuming to compute because they need to explore a large section of the environment, and it is not really suitable for operational time of humanoid robots yet. During this thesis, we have introduced some minor improvements to the standard ICP. One of the requirements of the DARPA Robotics Challenge was that for some of the tasks, it was assumed that the actual objects in the environment could have a different scale. For instance, the valve could be bigger or smaller in the actual setup than what we were told they would be. And if you try to do standard point-to-point iterative closest point with a difference of scale, it tends to get stuck in local minimas, and you are not able to estimate correctly the transformation between your model and the environment, and you cannot get the scale of the model either. So here we just reformulated ICP in Sim3 instead of the standard SE3 group. And as you can see, we are able to, from this position, to obtain the proper registration and scale for the valve. Another interest of using iterative closest points based on CAD models is that it's possible to detect discrepancies between where you have planned your motion and the actual environment. So here we can see in red is any point that has more than 2 centimeters of error with respect to the model. And here there is this bar that is not present in the real environment. And this handrail here is not present either. So this means that you will, maybe if you have planned some motion using this rail, you will need to replan your motion and do something else. now that we know where we want to establish our contacts with the environment, it is important to have a method to robustly reach them. And so as we've seen, the keyframe graph from Visual SLAM can be used to provide a point cloud that is used for registration of the CAD models, which provides a surface defined with respect to the keyframe graph, with respect to the environment. And what we need to accomplish the control is to know the position of any desired surface on the robot with respect to that same map. So here we use tracking from Visual SLAM. So we know the position of the camera with respect to the keyframe graph. And we also know the kinematics of the robot model, thanks to the calibration that we have previously done. Which, so this gives us, I don't think it's working anymore. So this gives us the position of any surface on the robot within the keyframe graph. Next, we can use this error between these two frames to formulate a task for the quadratic programming controller that tries to minimize the relative transformation between the end effector location and the surface you try to reach. The advantage here is that this task definition is dependent on the camera position, which means that any perturbation you apply to the robot will be directly visible and part of the minimization that you try to accomplish. So you will move your end effector to try and counteract the perturbation. A problem that occurred in practice when doing experiments using this is that Visual SLAM assumes that the environment is rigid for the view registration process. This is a common requirement. And if you have body parts of your robot that are moving in the field of view of your sensor, this breaks this assumption. So fortunately, the model of the robot is fully known, and we can reproject virtually the CAD model of the current state of the robot within the camera plane and use this information as a mask that allows to ignore some pixels within the registration process of SLAM. So this enables to be robust to self-observation. Of course, using this, we cannot discard human motion in the environment and other external motions. And this is not the focus of this thesis, so we will leave it to SLAM people. This proposed method was assessed using real scenarios with HRP2 robot. So here you can see that we do the registration of a staircase model with the point cloud that we just observed from the environment, and then try to reach a point above this handrail, and then we will perturbate the robot and try to maintain this position. So as you will see that it's being pulled back, and the contact location is detected as needed to move forward. So this means that if you pull backwards, you need to push your hand forward to keep the same position. And the same in the opposite direction. So we're taking into account here the state of the camera with respect to the handrail online. The next experiment is a bit longer. We started from an unknown initial position and started to walk towards the valve here. As the robot walks, the point cloud of the environment, sorry for the contrast, is being reconstructed and being refined as it walks. Once we get close to the valve, we can start to apply the registration process that we've just described and align a 3D CAD model of this valve with the real environment. So this is what's being done at the moment, and it provides these frames, so waypoint and the graph frame. And we work closer, and by doing a camera motion, we can still refine the camera locally, the point cloud, and get a better accuracy for the registration. So we re-perform automatically the registration because it's now pre-aligned, and use the closed-loop end effector task-based control strategy that we presented to robustly reach this contact. So here we started from like 5 meters away from the valve, we walked, and we are still able to robustly reach the center of the contact here for the graph. And even if we were to perturbate the robot, it would modify the end effector position to keep this position here. Yeah, so we go ahead. The next part of my work has been to explore the use of Visual SLAM into model predictive control for walking. So this work has been done in collaboration with Daniele De Simone from the Sapienza University of Rome. He spent 6 months in our lab, working with me to introduce the feedback from SLAM and force-torque sensor into their existing open-loop model predictive control strategy called the intrinsically stable MPC. So this MPC computes based on ZMP positions and COM position velocities. It computes the next footsteps that the robot will need to take, the position of the next footsteps, and an associated trajectory of the center of mass that allows the robot to remain stable in that configuration. The objectives for this model predictive control are expressed in terms of desired center of mass velocity. So you control your robot by telling it to go 1 meter per second forward in some direction, basically. And it will compute automatically the corresponding footsteps. So first, why do we want to do closed-loop control on such an MPC? If you don't allow to take footsteps and if you don't react to perturbations, you will fall in case of strong perturbations. Here there is a stabilizer that tries to keep the center of mass above the feet, but it's not allowed to step. Sorry. And in our case, we allow the robot to step and recompute a new center of mass trajectory. So when pushing the robot, it is reacting to the perturbation. So how do we estimate this state that allows us to do this? For the center of mass, we use a simple kinematic inertial estimator. So the idea is that you know the position of your camera, and you can estimate the position of the center of mass because you know the forward kinematics of your robot and the body inertias. One assumption of this MPC is that the footsteps are flat on the floor and will remain flat on the floor. So we reproject the center of mass, wall space center of mass position into the support foot frame, which allows us to observe unmodeled parts of the robot, such as the ankle flexibilities that we have that allow to absorb impacts in the context of walking. And these are significant flexibilities. You can push the robot by up to 10 centimeters forward on them, and they are not measured directly. For the ZMP, we chose to use force-torque sensors to obtain the measurement. It could, in theory, be obtained from the COM estimation that we have just done from Visual SLAM. The problem is that this requires the acceleration of the center of mass, and it's very noisy to obtain it directly from position. So instead, we chose to mix Visual SLAM with force-torque sensors because they provide very robust measurements of the ZMP. So to compute the MPC, we now use the estimated state of both the center of mass, position, velocity, and the ZMP. And this will lead the MPC to recompute a new trajectory that provides new footsteps and associated COM trajectory that is later tracked by the quadratic programming controller to accomplish the motion. Unfortunately, this estimation is not available at each control iteration because we are limited by the sensor frequency of the camera for Visual SLAM. So we have this estimation at 30 Hz in our experiments. And when this estimation is not available, we can integrate the LIP model as we would do in open loop to propagate the trajectory forward until we get the next measurement that will correct the mistakes that we did. Before showing the results of this experiment, we introduce also a very simple Cartesian regulation scheme. So this is merely just computing velocities that are required to reach a desired target in the environment. But this target will be provided with respect to the localization of the robot in SLAM map, which enables us to robustify the closed-loop work of the robot. So in the first experiment, we used both the closed-loop MPC and the Cartesian regulation scheme to work towards desired targets within the keyframe graph. As you can see on the right, there is the two pendulums. There is the red one is the estimation of the state of the robot, and the green one is the desired state that your MPC is trying to reach. And in blue, you have the footsteps that are being computed to reach these targets by the Cartesian regulation. The importance of doing feedback here on the position is that if you perform the same motion without taking into account the environment, you will quickly drift away from the expected desired target. This is due to many effects, such as slippage of the feet on the floor, such as footstep trajectory not being fully perfectly tracked by the quadratic programming controller, and so on. But in the case of taking into account the information from Visual SLAM, we are able to robustly reach the targets every time. So here's the same observation in the form of just curves. So there is a target position 1 meter forward, and you see that the robot overshoots by quite a lot. And as you continue the experiment, you drift further and further away from your intended target. But in the case of closed loop control using dense visual SLAM, we can show that we are able to robustly reach the 1 meter target here every time. And here there is some estimation mistake. We see that in green we have visual SLAM that thinks that it works 40 centimeters, while the ground truth measurements from Vicon system think that we work more than 50. This is a mistake in the estimation. But the interesting thing to note here is that regardless of this error, we are still able, on the next footsteps, to obtain the desired objectives. And this is due to the loop closure of Visual SLAM that enables to recover from mistakes in the localization by taking into account all the keyframes in the map. And here is the experiment performed to show that the closed loop model predictive control is able to react from strong perturbations by generating new footsteps and trajectories. And we have a Cartesian regulation scheme that is trying to remain at the initial position. So when perturbed, it will step around and come back instead of falling. And we finally reach the final closed loop strategy that we have implemented on the whole body controller. So here it's much more demanding because the controller runs very fast at 200 Hertz, and the estimation will need to have very high accuracy and high rate to be able to be used. So the concept is to take the open loop whole body controller that was previously developed in the lab and try to, instead of using the perfect model from integration to do the feedback, try to use the real measurements of the robot state. So these measurements are the position of the camera tracked from the robot images with Visual SLAM and the encoder measurements of your joints. And there is an estimator that will provide the joint positions and joint velocity that are required by the quadratic programming optimization. In doing so, we have discovered that this is indeed a very challenging problem. And some parts of it we expected, some parts we did not. For instance, the formulation of constraint that is typically used for our quadratic scheme turns out not to be not robust to noise. If you introduce some noise in the constraint, such as reaching a joint limit, it can overshoot the constraint, and this will lead to the problem not being solvable. Another aspect is that the tasks are not necessarily stable if you introduce feedback on your state. You cannot choose any gains. You cannot, if you have delays in your estimation, this will be problematic. If you have unmodeled dynamics, such as the anchor flexibilities, it adds some energy to the system that you do not observe, that you observe but do not account for in your whole body model, the dynamics. And all this means that just naively doing feedback on the whole body controller like this will be unstable. Or if it doesn't respect the constraints, it will not work. But to try it, we implemented a concept of virtual pure quadratic programming estimator. The idea is that since we have problems with the formulation of the constraints, and it would be complex to modify them, we implemented an estimation that supposes that these constraints are enforced. So for instance, we suppose that contacts that are defined in the QPA model are still respected in the estimation, and instead the error observed is spread elsewhere on the robot model, such as the joint flexibilities in the anchors, the joints, and so on. This enabled us to do a first preliminary experiment on whole body closed loop control. So the first part of this video is a comparison between open loop control and our quadratic programming estimator. And there is two robots here. Initially they are aligned, and there is a solid robot and there is a transparent one. The solid robot represents the estimation of the state of the robot, while the transparent one represents the open loop QP model. So what we think the robot is doing does not correspond exactly to what the robot is actually doing. Here we see it's leaning further backwards, which leads to poor establishment of contacts and ultimately will lead to failures of the tasks. And in this case, we perform the same experience, but by introducing the feedback from the virtual QP estimator inside the quadratic programming control. And this works in this case, and we are able to robustly reach contacts on the table here and more robustly on the floor, because we are taking into account the state of the robot with respect to its environment. Of course, the problems I mentioned of doing closed loop control on the whole body controller are still present. And this works because we are doing quasi-static motions and are quite constrained with the hand, so we don't excitate the flexibilities too much, and so on. So there is a lot of challenges to be solved. So sorry, you were seeing, I cannot show it again. You were seeing the difference I was talking about with contact establishment in the open loop and closed loop case. I will now conclude this talk by summarizing the main contributions. So the main point is that we showed that we are able to use dense visual SLAM for closed loop control of humanoid robot control at several levels. First, we introduced a kinematic chain calibration method that is pattern-free and extends the classical hand-eye method to a whole body kinematic chain and is able to be used online. Next, we showed that we can perform closed loop control at the level of multi-contact establishment. So we can recognize the position of surfaces in the environment that were by aligning a CAD model with it, and execute achieve the contacts by formulating a closed loop task space and effector control strategy. And finally, we have tackled the more challenging problem of using estimated state of the robot to perform closed loop model predictive control for work. In the short term, I will be staying here in the lab, and I will focus on finalizing the humanoid demonstration for the project, which will combine all the aspects of this thesis. Because the final demonstration requires us to walk from any place toward a staircase, to climb up the staircase, to go and reach some objects in the environment, some brackets that we will need to place at some specific place on the plane, to walk to this place, to place the brackets, so exploit the CAD model of the robot, the plane to know where the robot is, and so on. I would like also to try and do the A400M aircraft entry plan, the one I showed before with the green boxes, because this is a very challenging multi-contact scenario with very constrained environment, and it's very important to take into account the state of the robot at any time here. In the long term, I think it would be, I would like to explore inline multi-contact planning with respect to the environment. But in this thesis, we started from multi-contact planners that exist and perform their job on CAD models. But it would be interesting to use directly the surfaces within the map to be able to interact with any environment. Just like we do if we enter a room, we do not wait for somebody to give us a CAD model to do anything. We just look at the environment and interact with it. It would be nice to better exploit the environment also. So this is ongoing works in semantic labs, for instance, that instead of just obtaining a point cloud of the environment with no knowledge associated to it, we'll have some semantic information. This is a table, I can put my hand on it. And this is a phone, I can grab it, and so on. And there is the work we did on closed loop QP control have given rise to a thesis that just started this year by Mohamed Jeha that will be studying the problematics of the constraints and tasks in closed loop for QP. And I will be working with him on continuing this work. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions.